Okay, and now I would like to begin, first of all, for thanking you for giving me the opportunity to speak to you today. I've learned a lot already over the course of our discussions. And to begin this first panel, I'm going to become a bit more specific and try to take the questions that we heard in the first two lectures and to break them down to the question as to what are the values of the European Union. Let me begin, first of all, what are values? What do I mean by values? And when I talk about values, then I mean that these are basic, standardized principles which can structure law and political activities. This can also be called constitutional principles. We're talking about legally structured values in the European Union, and these are formulated in abstract terms intentionally. These are not targets or strategies. They are not policies, nor are they the implementation. We're talking about abstract constitutional principles. In the EU, compared to nation-states' constitutions and systems, these are rather thin in terms of their formulation. They have a legal character, but there is also a conflict of interpretation there as well. Why? Let me begin by saying that the EU is based on historic and cultural heritage, which was described in detail by Professor Leonhardt, and this is then enshrined in the rule of law and democracies of the member states. That is what the EU is built on. These values have been confirmed, and based on these, they have formulated their own values. This is something that was done rather late in time because, as you know, the European Union was not the European Union for a long time. It was the European Community for Coal and Steel, a European Economic Community, and then the European Community. So it was a question primarily of integrating the economy and the single market. Not until 1993 did we have a lot of contracts, and then we had the Maastricht Agreement. And with the Treaty of Maastricht, that's where the political values were defined in more detail and more specifically. We had some before that, but with the Treaty of Maastricht, we saw a development where this was given a broader base. Now, the first step there was I have 4 steps. The Copenhagen criteria. We've all heard that. These are the criteria for accession by new member states, and these were divided in 1993. And these also are institutional stability as a guarantee for democratic and order by the rule of law. And this is also observance of human rights and protection of the young. And here we have a market economy and an acceptance of the acquis communautaire, in other words, the legal structure of the European Union. So what we have here is a criterion which says democracy and rule of law are combined, and these are criteria for accession to the EU. Now, this has been defined in Article 49 of the Treaty of the European Union. Now, this treaty also defines in Article 2 the values of the European Union. I'd like to read this out to you right now. I'm quoting. The values on which the Union is based are respect of human dignity, freedom, democracy, equality, rule of law, and observation of human rights, including the rights of individuals that belong to minorities. These values are recognized by all of the countries in the community by pluralism. This means non-discrimination, tolerance, justice, solidarity, and equality of the genders. So I believe that this is very special when we compare this to the rest of the world. Many of these values have been codified by the United Nations, but they are not standard in most countries of the world. Now, in addition to this, we have the EU as a member of the Human Rights Convention, and the fourth part of this, when we talk about the values of the Charter of Basic Rights. This Charter of Basic Rights defines a basic list of human rights, civil rights, and freedoms, and institutional rights. So we have a rather comprehensive list now of EU-related basic rights, and, as you have seen, a relatively comprehensive list of UN-related values. So as a Democrat, I would say this is wonderful. But we have to implement all of this, because what we can see here is that these values, these are at a level of values, not at the level of the targets or policies, but these values are controversial. So we see, for example, Poland, Hungary, and Romania as specific examples. You've seen this again and again. I'm sure Mr. Orban is quoted, and he goes to Brussels, and Mr. Juncker says this is not going to work this way. And what does Mr. Juncker mean when he says this won't work? That is to say, non-respect of basic principles of democratic rule of law. For example, freedom of the press or the separation of powers, which is something that has been restricted in Hungary. That means that a value such as democracy and rule of law has to be maintained. You must not go below a certain minimum. Now, that means that the values of the EU are abstract, and if you like, they are not worded in all that much detail, but they are based on the cultural consensus of the member states. But they're still controversial. And it's a question about the crisis in Europe. My hypothesis is that the crisis in the EU is due to the fact that it's more a question of discussions that are needed in order to reinforce all of this. Now, what the EU has done so far is the EU tries to take on a certain process. This is something that I'm not going to read out. It's part of the treaty, this process that's been used. But let me evaluate Article 7. We've had this against Austria, for example. We've seen that it's very difficult to implement this. And it's also something that is not a toothless tiger, but it's a very weak tiger. In other words, countries that do not abide by all of these rule of law criteria, it's really difficult to get them to do so in the EU. And what should we do then? Well, I think, this is my assessment, if the EU allows these values internally to be weakened, then it will be undermining its own base. I think we need to make these rights more binding for everyone. We need stronger instruments for control, monitoring, and implementation. And I tend to agree with the new president of the Commission, Ursula von der Leyen. She said these need to apply to everyone because this is a strategic conclusion, a type of flaming. In other words, we can avoid some of these outliers. This means we could have a check on the rule of law for all member states. And to conclude, I would like to tell you why I think this is important. As I said before, we heard that China and the United States and other countries need to be mentioned here. China has shown us that market economy and prosperity can be achieved without democracy. And I still believe that these values belong together, a sort of type of social market economy, that this is a success model for Europe. And I think this is important, not only important, but also very useful. Market economy can work without democracy, but we know that democracies overall are more stable and more prosperous. And that is why I think it's European values which can help the world a lot. And I also believe that Europe and the European Union can take a lot of the problems mentioned by Professor Tamir can be solved by the European Union. And that brings me to my final conclusion, and that is that I think that we need to reinforce Europe. We need to clarify the open questions with Poland, Hungary, and Romania. And we also have to discuss what our targets are. Not only values, but what should be the targets of the EU? What is the common good? What do we have in common? What do we want to achieve with the European Union beyond simply securing peace? And if we have achieved this, this will strengthen us internally, and then we can be a success model to the outside world. I'm very pleased to be discussing the EU today, and I would like to invite all of you to do so and to take all of this back home with you. I think this is more necessary than ever before. Now, for our discussion, I'd now like to open up the round table, and I'd like to ask the panelists to come up on stage.